everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of our daily updates, Hope in the Time of Corona. My name's Sophie, I'm the ordinator at Hope if we haven't met yet, and we also have Lola here and Bertie over there who might be joining us, might be getting bored and leaving partway through. And today we are continuing our series in the book of Luke. We thought it'd be good to have some continuity with our Sunday sermon series. So today we are reading Luke chapter 9 verses 1 to 10, which I'm reading in the NIV if you want to follow along with me. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was sure he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So this morning, as we look at this, I just want to briefly reflect on Zacchaeus and then the crowd and then Jesus, thinking about how these might relate to us today. So firstly, Zacchaeus, and I'm going to start with a bit of a story. So picture the scene. It was the year 1999. I was 8 years old and I was in Disneyland, Paris. And all of a sudden, Mickey Mouse appeared. And as you can imagine, a huge crowd gathered around him. And I really wanted to get Mickey's autograph, but I found myself at the back of the crowd. So what I did was I left my auntie and my cousin and I got on my hands and knees and I crawled through the crowd right to the front and stood up in front of Mickey with a pen and a notebook in hand, ready to receive his autograph. Now, Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, but he was short and he couldn't see over the crowd. So he climbed up a tree to get a better view of this man that everybody was talking about. And unlike me pushing my way to the front of the crowd to meet Mickey face to face, Zacchaeus gets a better view by climbing up a tree, a place which I imagine would have allowed him to have a good view of Jesus, but he wouldn't have expected Jesus to be able to see him. He wasn't in his line of sight. And Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and tax collectors were hated at the time. They were known for being dishonest and unethical, which probably explains why Zacchaeus was up a tree rather than at the front of the crowd. But Jesus, when he gets there, he looks up and he calls Zacchaeus by name, and he tells him that he needs to stay at his house. And Zacchaeus responds, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This shows how encounter with Jesus was transformative for Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus was in a profession where he cheated the system and he took people's money and he accepted bribes. And here he's promising to pay back 4 times the amount of anything that he gained dishonestly. And this was far above what the law required. So in Leviticus 6 and in Numbers 5, we read that if anybody wrongs another, the way to make that right is to return to them what they've taken and then to add a 5th on top of that amount. So Zacchaeus promising 4 times the amount far exceeds what the expectations of the law required. His encounter with Jesus was transformative. An encounter with Jesus is transformative. It was then for Zacchaeus, and it is today. It can be transformative for us. So I just have a few questions for us to consider. How has encounter with Jesus transformed the way that we live? How are we changed by relationship with Jesus? How are we living in response to his love and forgiveness and grace? Next, I want to see you later, Lola. Next, I want to consider the crowd. The crowd have gathered to see Jesus. And we can imagine that there were people who led a good life and followed the law and tried to live honestly. Yet, out of everybody there, it's Zacchaeus. It's Zacchaeus' name that Jesus calls. And it's Zacchaeus whose house Jesus says he wants to stay at. And it's Zacchaeus who is remembered 2,000 years later by name in the story. Dishonest, unethical, tax collector Zacchaeus. And the crowd are indignant. Why him? There's a sense that it doesn't seem fair. It's uncomfortable to admit that we might resonate somehow with how the crowd feel here. That if I'm honest, I do relate to them, and I wonder if you do in some way as well. It can feel unfair when someone gets noticed and we don't, especially if we're honest, when we feel like we deserve it more. Maybe we've worked harder or we've tried harder. And I think that's how the crowd feel. Many have probably been following the law and trying to live a good life, yet in comparison to Zacchaeus, a sinner, they feel unnoticed. Now, we don't like to admit it, but I wonder if anybody has those thoughts in the kind of quiet of our hearts when it's just between us and God, or even just us feeling it and not even bringing it to God, that we might sometimes feel that way. So a few more questions. How can we resist reacting like the crowd when someone is noticed above us? How can we avoid feelings of pride and superiority? How can we learn to be more humble and more generous and more loving? These are hard questions, but it's worth thinking about how we're relating to the crowd, and maybe even just admitting that we do sometimes. And lastly, I want to look at Jesus in this story. So I've mentioned that Jesus knows Zacchaeus by name. And despite his lifestyle, it's Zacchaeus that Jesus goes to stay with. Because as the passage ends, Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. People labelled Zacchaeus a sinner, unclean, unworthy, unethical, untrustworthy, unlikable. But Jesus doesn't label Zacchaeus any of these things. Instead, he calls him a son of Abraham. And Abraham obviously had literal sons, Isaac and Jacob, who then became the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. And by calling Zacchaeus a son of Abraham, Jesus is saying that by having faith, he's part of that chosen people, which is no longer limited to a specific group, but it's available to anybody that puts their trust in God. In meeting Zacchaeus, in calling him by name, in telling him that he is a son of Abraham, God is saying, I see you, I know you by name, I love you. So to finish, I don't have a set of questions. Those questions that I had earlier were maybe a bit challenging. I have a set of statements that I want to end with. God sees you. He knows you by name. He loves you. And I especially want to speak that over you in this season where many of us, if not all of us, watching this are in some kind of isolation, whether it's self-isolation or just spending a lot of time in the house and not doing an awful lot. You can feel really alone. So I'm just going to say those again to you because you're not alone. God sees you. He knows you by name. He loves you. See you soon, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye.